I was fired for having a second job. They didn't realize which job kept them alive. I never thought I'd share this, but I'm still angry enough that the memory hasn't faded. And maybe writing it out is the only way to make sense of how fast everything collapsed. This happened 2 years ago, in what was supposed to be the most stable phase of my career, the part where you stop grinding and finally coast a little. I was 36, working in operations at a mid-sized logistics company, the kind that loved words like family and resilience in all-hands meetings, but panicked the second profits dipped. I'd been there almost 7 years, long enough to watch 3 reorganizations, 2 CEOs, and an endless parade of consultants who charged more in a week than I made in a year. I was dependable, invisible, and exhausted in that quiet way that feels like background radiation. People came to me when things broke, not because my title was impressive, but because I knew how everything actually worked once the dashboard stopped updating. I trained half the managers who now outranked me. I fixed errors before they showed up in reports. I answered emails at midnight because no one else knew what to do. I told myself this was what loyalty looked like, that eventually someone would notice, that patience was a strategy and not just fear dressed up as professionalism. The morning it all began unraveling, I was sitting at my desk with cold coffee, reviewing a process doc I'd written 3 years earlier under someone else's name, when I got a Slack message from HR asking if I could hop on a quick call. No agenda, no warning, just that cheery phrasing that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. I remember smoothing my sweater like it mattered, closing irrelevant tabs like this was a performance, and telling myself I was overreacting. I wasn't. By the time the calendar invite appeared, marked confidential, I already knew something was wrong. I just didn't know yet how thoroughly they'd decided my story for me. The call was scheduled for 9:12 a.m., which sounds like a normal time until you realize nobody schedules anything at 9:12 unless they're trying to wedge it between meetings, like it's casual, like it's not a big deal, like it's not about to detonate your life. I clicked join, and my screen filled with 3 tiles. Marcy from HR with her camera angled too high, my director Evan with that stiff smile he used when he wanted to seem friendly while saying no, and a third tile that was just a black circle labeled legal guest. My throat went dry so fast I actually swallowed wrong. Marcy launched into her script with that syrupy voice HR people use when they're about to say something cruel, but want to sound like a wellness app. "We're conducting a review related to a potential conflict of interest," she said, pausing like she expected me to nod and help her. Evan stared at the corner of his screen like he couldn't bear to look at me directly, which told me he'd known longer than I had. "We received information that you may be employed elsewhere," Marcy continued, and then she shared her screen. A photo. Grainy, zoomed in, taken at night. It showed me walking out of a building downtown, wearing my winter coat and holding my tote bag, mid-step under a streetlight. The timestamp in the corner was from the previous Thursday. "Do you recognize this?" she asked. I stared at my own blurry face and felt something cold settle behind my ribs. "Yes," I said, because lying felt pointless, and also because I was suddenly furious at how little evidence they needed to start swinging. "That's you entering a competitor's building after hours," Evan said finally, like he'd been holding his breath. Competitor. That word felt dramatic, like we were in some spy movie instead of a logistics company that couldn't keep printers stocked. "I was downtown," I said carefully. "I met a friend. That's not a competitor's building. It's a co-working space with like 50 companies in it." The legal tile stayed silent. Marcy tilted her head, sympathetic in a way that wasn't sympathy. "We've been informed you're working a second job," she said. "Our handbook requires disclosure and prohibits employment that could create conflict." My heart started pounding so hard, I could feel it in my teeth. Here's the thing. I did have a second job, not because I was greedy or sneaky, but because my rent went up, my student loans restarted, and my annual merit increase was 2.3% while groceries doubled. 2 nights a week, I worked at a boutique wine shop owned by my cousin's friend, mostly restocking shelves and ringing people up while they asked if rosé was too sweet. It was humiliating in the way only survival is humiliating when you're doing it quietly. But I hadn't disclosed it because I didn't even think it counted as employment in the spirit of their policy, and also because the same company that told us to practice self-care would absolutely have used it to judge me. Marcy's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she could sense the truth in the pause before I spoke. "Can you confirm whether you have another job?" she asked. I could have lied. I could have danced around it. But the photo told me they'd already decided I was guilty of something, and my honesty was not going to save me from their storyline, so I exhaled and said, "Yes, I work part-time. It has nothing to do with our industry." Evan's mouth tightened, and I knew in that instant they weren't here to clarify. They were here to finalize. Marcy nodded slowly like she was listening, but her eyes had that glazed-over look of someone following a flowchart, not a conversation, and she said, "Thank you for confirming," in the same tone you'd use if someone admitted they forgot to return a library book. Evan finally leaned forward, clasping his hands together like a pastor about to deliver bad news he believed was necessary for your growth. He said they had concerns about bandwidth, about commitment, about how working a second job could impact performance, even though my last 3 reviews were spotless, and I'd been praised publicly for going above and beyond more times than I could count. I waited for someone to mention results, metrics, anything measurable, but instead, Marcy brought up policy language, scrolling through a PDF as if the words themselves were enough to erase 7 years of history. I tried to explain, not defensively at first, just factually, that my second job was retail, that I didn't use company equipment, didn't work overlapping hours, didn't even think about logistics while restocking wine bottles. Evan nodded like he understood, then said, "The issue isn't what the job is, it's that you didn't disclose it." That was the pivot, the moment the conversation snapped into place, because now it wasn't about conflict of interest, it was about trust. I could feel the ground shifting under me as Marcy said, "Failure to disclose is considered a violation regardless of intent." Intent, apparently, was a decorative concept, nice to talk about, but not something they planned to factor in. I asked, very calmly, whether there had been any complaints about my performance, any missed deadlines, any evidence that my work had suffered. Evan hesitated, just a fraction too long, then said, "This isn't about performance." That's when I realized they'd already done the math and decided I was expendable. I was one of the highest paid individual contributors on the team, not because my salary was outrageous, but because I'd been there long enough for raises to stack, and they'd been hinting for months about streamlining and lean operations. The photo wasn't the cause, it was the excuse. The legal tile finally spoke, a man's voice with no face saying, "Based on the information we have, we're moving forward with termination effective today." Just like that. No warning, no improvement plan, no chance to retroactively disclose or explain. My ears started ringing, but I still managed to ask, "So to be clear, I'm being fired for working a part-time retail job?" Marcy said, "For failing to disclose outside employment in violation of policy, which felt like the corporate version of telling me it was raining when someone had just pushed me into a pool." Evan added something about severance, 2 weeks, contingent on signing an agreement, and how security would help me collect my things. I noticed he still wouldn't look at me. I thought about all the times I'd covered for him in meetings, fed him answers in Slack, quietly fixed mistakes before his boss noticed. The call ended with Marcy wishing me the best in my future endeavors. And when the screen went dark, I just sat there staring at my reflection, trying to understand how a second job meant to keep me afloat had become the reason they cut me loose. Security showed up faster than I expected, which somehow hurt more than the firing itself, because it meant this had been planned down to the minute. A guy named Trevor I'd seen around the office but never spoken to stood awkwardly at my desk while I packed, pretending to scroll on his phone so he wouldn't have to witness the humiliation up close. I moved slowly, partly because my hands were shaking, and partly because I was furious at how quickly they wanted me erased. I unplugged my laptop, slid my notebook into my bag, took the framed photo of my sister and me at the beach that had survived 3 desk moves. Around me, the office hummed like nothing had changed. Keyboards clacking, phones ringing, people laughing too loudly near the break room. A few coworkers glanced over, then immediately looked away. That universal corporate instinct to not see something that might someday happen to you. As we walked toward the elevator, my Slack started lighting up on my phone with messages I couldn't open anymore because my access had already been cut. "What's going on? Are you okay? Call me." I felt detached, like I was watching someone else's life implode in real time. In the lobby, Trevor handed me my tote and said, "Sorry about this," in a voice so quiet it was barely sound, then turned and walked back inside like I'd never existed. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, and I stood there for a second because I genuinely didn't know where to go. I'd been fired at 9:27 a.m. on a Tuesday. I wasn't supposed to be free. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel until my phone buzzed again. This time a text from the wine shop owner asking if I could cover an extra shift that evening because someone had called out. I laughed, actually laughed out loud, a short, ugly sound that startled me because I just lost my real job and the only work I had left was the one that had supposedly ruined everything. I texted back yes because I needed the money and because sitting alone with my thoughts felt unbearable. Driving home, I kept replaying the call in my head, searching for the moment where I could have said something differently, disclosed earlier, fought harder, but the truth settled in like a bruise. They wanted me gone, and the second job was just the cleanest way to justify it. What I didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that in their rush to cut ties, they'd completely misunderstood what I actually did for them and which job really mattered. That afternoon, I did what every freshly fired person does, even if they swear they won't. I opened my laptop at my kitchen table and started obsessively scrolling through old emails, trying to piece together whether I'd missed signs or if this had been in motion for months. My personal inbox still had threads from Evan thanking me for saving the quarter when a major client's shipment data went sideways, and I stared at those words like they were written about a stranger. The company laptop was gone, my access was gone, but my brain was still running like it always did, checking for errors, predicting next steps, trying to control something. I kept thinking about that photo, that grainy little gotcha, and the way they'd all said competitor like it was obvious. They hadn't asked who I worked for. They hadn't asked what I did. They just slotted me into a narrative where I was disloyal and untrustworthy because it made the decision feel righteous instead of convenient. By 6, I was behind the wine shop counter wearing a black apron and pretending my life hadn't just been rearranged. Customers came in asking for holiday gifts, laughing, making small talk, and I smiled automatically because retail requires a kind of performance that's almost soothing when your real world is falling apart. During a lull, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I let it ring once, twice, then answered with my professional voice out of habit. "Hi, it's Devin." A familiar voice cut in, breathless. Devin was one of the senior analysts on my old team, the guy who always asked me to just take a quick look at things because he knew I'd fix them. Are you free?" he asked, like he didn't know how to say fired. I glanced at the security camera above the register, at the quiet aisle of imported olive oils, and said, "I'm at my other job, so technically, yes." He didn't laugh. "The dashboard is wrong," he said, like really wrong. "The Tuesday shipments are showing as delivered, but the carrier feeds are blank, and the client is already emailing." My stomach tightened with a reflexive sense of responsibility, the muscle memory of putting out fires. "Did you check the integration logs?" I asked automatically, already picturing the system in my head. "We can't," he said. "We can't access the admin panel. It's locked behind your credentials." I went cold, not because I wanted them to fail, not because I was plotting anything, but because I'd warned Evan for over a year that our operations reporting was held together by a patchwork of tools only I truly understood. I'd offered training, I'd documented processes, I'd begged for a backup admin. They'd always said later. Later never came, because later required them to admit I was essential. Devin lowered his voice like he was afraid someone would hear him through the phone. "HR says you're not allowed to help," he whispered, "but Evan told me to call you anyway. Off the record." I stared at the bottles lined up behind the counter, all neat labels and fake calm, and I realized the story was about to shift. They'd fired me in the morning, but by evening, the consequences were already knocking. I told Devin I couldn't help, not because I didn't know how, but because saying it out loud made it real, and also because HR had already turned me into a liability instead of a person. He went quiet for a second, then said, "Yeah, I figured." But his voice cracked in a way that told me this wasn't just a minor glitch. After I hung up, I stood there behind the register longer than necessary, replaying every meeting where I'd tried to explain how fragile our setup actually was, how the reporting pipeline depended on a series of custom scripts and manual checks that lived mostly in my head. I'd asked for redundancy. I'd asked for time to train someone. I'd been told we were resource-constrained and that my systems were holding up just fine. That night, after closing, I drove home in silence, the kind where you don't even turn on the radio because you're bracing for what comes next. By the time I unlocked my apartment, I had 3 voicemails from numbers I recognized immediately. Evan, one of the project managers, someone from finance. I didn't listen to them yet. I microwaved leftovers I barely tasted and sat on my couch staring at the dark TV screen like it might tell me what to do. When I finally pressed play on Evan's voicemail, his voice sounded tight, controlled, trying not to panic. He said they were experiencing unexpected discrepancies, and that it would be helpful if I could answer a few questions, strictly informational, no obligation. The irony almost made me choke. 12 hours earlier, I'd been a risk. Now I was a resource again. I didn't call back, not out of spite, but because I needed one night where I wasn't responsible for their mess. The next morning, I woke up to a LinkedIn notification that someone had viewed my profile, then another, then another. By noon, my inbox had a message from a recruiter asking if I'd be open to contract work, given my background in operations data integrity. I laughed again, softer this time, because the universe has a sense of humor like that. Around 2, Devin texted instead of calling, "Client escalated, CFO involved." That was when I knew this wasn't going to blow over. The system I'd built wasn't just a nice to have, it was the lens through which leadership understood their own business, and without it, they were blind. I still didn't want revenge. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted them to understand that firing me so casually had consequences that no policy language could smooth over. I put my phone face down and went for a walk, breathing cold air, letting the anger settle into something sharper and calmer. By the time I came back, I'd made a decision, not about whether I'd help them, but about the terms under which I ever would again. At 4:06 p.m., Evan finally called me directly, not through Devin, not through some carefully worded email, but my actual phone number, and I watched it ring while I counted my breaths like I was defusing a bomb. When I answered, he didn't bother with small talk. "We need your help," he said, and the word need landed hard because I'd spent years being told my needs were inconvenient. In the background, I could hear that familiar office chaos, muffled voices, someone typing aggressively, the ping of Slack notifications that used to live in my bones. "What's happening?" I asked, even though I already knew. He exhaled like he'd been holding it all day. "The client portal metrics are off. The carrier feeds aren't reconciling. Finance is freaking out because revenue recognition ties to those delivery confirmations. We can't close the week if the data's wrong." I leaned against my kitchen counter, staring at the tiny crack in the laminate I'd been meaning to fix, and felt something almost like calm. "Did you roll back the ingestion patch?" I asked. Silence. Then, "What patch?" Evan said, and that was the moment my anger stopped being emotional and turned logistical. 2 weeks earlier, I'd pushed a hotfix to handle a vendor's API change, and I'd written a clear note in our changelog about the temporary workaround and the follow-up steps needed after quarter end. I'd flagged it in our Monday stand-up. I'd messaged Evan directly. He'd reacted with a thumbs-up emoji and never asked another question. "You don't know what patch?" I repeated. "We can't access your admin credentials," he said quickly, skipping past it, as if the problem was my locked door and not the fact that they'd built the whole house on one key. "HR says you're terminated, so IT won't restore access. But we just need you to tell us where to look." It was almost impressive how he phrased it like I was withholding information instead of being forcibly removed from the building. "Evan," I said, keeping my voice even, "yesterday you fired me for not disclosing I worked at a wine shop. Today you're asking me to fix your reporting architecture off the clock with no access. Do you hear yourself?" He swallowed audibly, and for a second he sounded like a real person, not a director. "I didn't want this," he said, "but it happened, and now you have a mess," I finished. He rushed in. "I can make it right. We can do a consulting agreement, short term, just to stabilize things." Consulting. The word made my stomach twist because I'd been doing consultant-level work for employee pay for years. "Send me something in writing," I said. "Rates, scope, timeline." Evan hesitated. "Marcy won't like that," he admitted. I almost laughed. Marcy already liked firing me, so we're past caring what she likes. He tried again, softer. "Please, the client's threatening to walk." I thought about the client, a massive retailer who treated us like a utility and screamed when the lights flickered. I thought about my former team, the juniors who'd be blamed when leadership couldn't explain the numbers. And I thought about myself, standing behind a wine counter the night before, feeling small. "Here's what I can do," I said. "I'll look at it for 1 hour, from my side, with whatever information you can legally share. After that, if you want anything more, it's paid. Up front." He didn't answer immediately, but I could hear him calculating the cost of pride versus the cost of failure. "Okay," he said finally, voice tight. "Okay, I'll get you something." When we hung up, my hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. It was the tremor of realizing I finally had leverage, and the terrifying clarity that I'd spent years thinking leverage was something other people were allowed to have. By 6:30 p.m., Evan emailed a consulting services agreement that looked like it had been ripped from some template folder labeled emergency, complete with mismatched fonts and a clause about good faith cooperation that made me snort. The rate line was blank. The scope was basically, "help us," which wasn't scope so much as a confession. I replied with 3 sentences. My hourly rate, triple what my salary worked out to, a 2-hour minimum per session, and a requirement that any work beyond my initial 1-hour review required payment before access was restored. 10 minutes later, he called again, voice strained like he was trying not to sound desperate in front of whoever was sitting next to him. "That rate is high," he said. I pictured Marcy hovering behind his chair with her HR smile, ready to remind him I was terminated. "It's the rate for someone you fired and now need," I said. "It's the rate for institutional knowledge you chose not to back up." He didn't argue after that, which told me the situation had gotten worse while we were talking. "Finance will approve it," he said quickly. "Can you start tonight?" I looked at the clock, then at the schedule taped to my fridge for the wine shop, then back at my laptop. "Send the payment confirmation," I said. "Then I'll start." 30 minutes later, an ACH receipt landed in my inbox, and I felt my shoulders drop in a way that almost made me dizzy. Not because I was thrilled, but because for the first time in years, my time wasn't being extracted with guilt and praise. It was being purchased. Evan sent me a screen share link through his personal email, because HR had already locked down official channels. And when I joined, the conference room behind him looked like a low-budget disaster movie. People standing, laptops open, someone scribbling on a whiteboard like they were trying to summon answers. Devin was there, eyes wide with relief when he saw me on screen. Marcy wasn't, which I took as a small mercy. Evan started explaining what they'd tried, and within 5 minutes, I realized they hadn't just lost reporting, they'd broken the reconciliation layer that fed half our client billing logic. The hotfix I'd warned about, someone had cleaned it up without understanding why it existed, and now the carrier API responses were being parsed wrong, flagging undelivered shipments as complete. "Who changed the mapping?" I asked. Evan blinked. "IT," he said, vague. "Which person?" I pressed, because systems don't break themselves, people break them with confidence. Devin muttered a name, Caleb, a new systems admin who'd started 3 weeks earlier, and I felt my jaw tighten. They'd fired the person who built the bridge, then handed the controls to someone still reading the manual. I asked for logs. Evan said they couldn't pull them without admin access. I stared at him, then said, "So you want me to diagnose a production failure with no telemetry?" He looked embarrassed, like he'd finally heard how absurd it sounded. "Can you tell us where the logs are stored?" he asked. "I can," I said, "but you won't like the answer." And when I told them the logs were in the very admin console they'd locked behind my credentials, the room went quiet in that way that isn't silence but dread settling onto surfaces. I walked them through it slowly, not to be cruel, but because this was the only way they'd actually understand the mess they were in. I explained how the ingestion layer fed the reconciliation service, how the temporary patch rerouted malformed carrier responses into a holding table instead of the live billing feed, and how removing it without updating the parser caused the system to happily mark shipments complete even when the data was empty. Devin kept nodding like it was clicking for the first time. Evan looked physically ill. "So how bad is it?" someone off-screen asked. I didn't answer right away because I was doing the math in my head, calculating the ripple effects. "If you don't stop the billing job," I said finally, "you'll overstate revenue, issue invoices that don't match reality, and then have to restate once the carriers catch up. That's a compliance nightmare." The word compliance made Evan flinch. "Can we fix it?" he asked. "Not tonight," I said. "Not without access." There was frantic whispering in the room, papers shuffling, someone swearing under their breath. Evan muted himself, then unmuted. "HR says restoring your access sets a bad precedent," he said, like he was reciting from a script. I stared at my own face in the corner of the screen and felt something snap into place. "Then you'll need to decide what's more important," I said, "precedent or accuracy." Silence again. I could almost see Marcy's influence hovering in the air, the fear of admitting they'd been wrong outweighing the fear of actual damage. "I can't help you without tools," I added, "and I won't guess." Devin spoke up then, voice shaking slightly. "She's right," he said. "We're blind without her." Evan closed his eyes for a second, then nodded like someone conceding a point they never wanted to argue. "Okay," he said. "I'll talk to IT. Stay on." 10 minutes passed. 20. I listened to the murmur of chaos on the other end while I sat alone in my kitchen, realizing how surreal it was that the company that had escorted me out with security now couldn't function without my permission. Finally, Evan came back, looking defeated. "They'll restore read-only admin access," he said, "temporarily." "Read-only won't fix it," I replied. "It'll just let me confirm how broken it is." He rubbed his temples. "What do you need?" "Full admin," I said. "Time-boxed, logged, with an email stating I'm authorized to make changes." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll get it." When the access finally came through and the console loaded on my screen, the familiar architecture unfolded like a map I knew by heart. Within 5 minutes, I found the exact commit that had caused the cascade, a well-meaning cleanup that had stripped out the safeguards I'd built. I flagged it, explained the fix, and told them exactly what would happen next if they followed my instructions. "Do this," I said. "Pause billing, roll back the change, reconcile manually for 48 hours. Evan looked like he wanted to cry. "And after that?" he asked. I met his eyes through the screen. "After that," I said, We talk about why you fired the only person who knew this system end to end. By midnight, the immediate fire was contained, not extinguished, just boxed in tightly enough that it wouldn't burn the building down overnight, and the mood on the call had shifted from panic to something heavier and more uncomfortable. Evan kept thanking me in that frantic way people do when gratitude is tangled up with guilt, while Devin barely spoke, eyes glued to the numbers updating correctly for the first time all day. When I logged out, I didn't feel triumphant, just tired in a deep, bone-level way, like I'd run a marathon I never signed up for. The next morning, Marcy finally reached out directly, and the email was exactly what you'd expect. Polite, sanitized, full of phrases like reassessment and mutual benefit. She asked if I'd be open to a conversation about reinstatement options, which was almost impressive given how confident she'd sounded when she fired me less than 48 hours earlier. I stared at the message for a long time before replying, because part of me wanted to ignore it, to let them sit in the discomfort of their own decisions. But another part of me wanted something else, something cleaner than revenge. I wrote back that I was open to discussing a long-term consulting arrangement, not reinstatement, and that any conversation would need to include leadership and legal. Within an hour, I had a calendar invite for that afternoon. This time, the call started differently. Evan looked relieved but wary. Marcy looked tense, her smile thinner than before. Legal was back, camera still off. Marcy opened by saying the company recognized my contributions and regretted the abrupt nature of the separation, which was as close to an apology as I was going to get. I let her finish, then said calmly, "I don't want my job back." The silence that followed was almost comical. Evan blinked. Marcy frowned slightly. I explained that what I wanted was control over my time, clear boundaries, and compensation that reflected the reality of my role. I laid out a proposal I'd drafted that morning. A 6-month consulting contract, remote, limited hours, with a defined scope focused on stabilizing and documenting the systems they'd ignored for years. I named my rate again, without flinching. Legal cleared his throat. "That's significantly higher than my salary?" I interrupted. "Yes, that's the point." Evan didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like someone finally accepting gravity. Marcy tried once more to frame it as generous, as an exception, and I shut that down too, because I was done being grateful for scraps. By the end of the call, they agreed to everything, pending signatures, and when it ended, I sat back in my chair and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not victory, not relief, agency. For the first time since I joined that company, the terms were mine. The contract hit my inbox the next day, and seeing my name under consultant instead of employee felt like stepping out of a room where the air had been slowly thinning for years. I should have felt vindicated, but what I actually felt was a wary, guarded calm, like my nervous system didn't trust good news anymore. The first week was a blur of access requests, permission tickets, and me repeatedly explaining to people I used to work beside that no, I couldn't just hop on for a second unless it was inside the scope we'd agreed to. The word scope became my new religion. I set office hours. I stopped answering Slack at midnight because I wasn't even on Slack anymore. I made them use email, tickets, documentation, all the grown-up systems they'd avoided because leaning on me had been easier. Evan tried to slide back into old habits fast, sending me frantic messages like, "Quick question," with no context. And the first time I replied with, "Please submit this through the tracker," he sounded genuinely offended, like boundaries were personal attacks. That was the part that hurt in a new way, realizing how much of my value had been my willingness to be endlessly available. Still, I did the work. I mapped the pipeline from carrier feeds to billing outputs, created diagrams so clear even finance could follow them, and recorded training sessions for the analysts who'd been thrown into the deep end. Devin showed up for every single one, taking notes like his future depended on it, because it did. Caleb, the new admin who'd made the cleanup change, avoided my calls for days until Evan forced him into a session, and when he finally joined, he looked like a kid who'd broken a vase and been told to apologize to the person who bought it. I didn't yell. I didn't shame him. I explained why the safeguards existed, and I watched the exact moment comprehension replaced confidence in his eyes. That, more than anything, made me furious at leadership, because Caleb wasn't the villain. He was just the predictable outcome of a company that refused to invest in continuity. Halfway through week 2, Marcy asked to check in, and I could tell she expected gratitude, maybe even humility, like I should be thankful they'd found a way to keep me involved. Instead, I asked her, point blank, what process changes they were making so this never happened again. She gave me a vague answer about policy review and manager training, and I said, "No, I mean operationally. Redundant access, cross-training, documentation time baked into schedules." Silence. Then she said, "We'll take it under advisement." Under advisement was corporate for we'll forget the second the crisis stops. I ended the call and stared at my calendar full of neatly boxed consultant hours, and I realized the real test wasn't whether they'd pay me now, it was whether they'd learn, or whether they'd just wait until they could replace me again. By week 4, the urgency had faded just enough for the company's old instincts to creep back in, and I could feel the shift even through email. Tickets took longer to get approved, meetings got rescheduled. Evan started talking about budget pressure again, like the crisis had been an anomaly instead of a preview. That's when I noticed something that confirmed what I'd suspected all along. They weren't preparing to function without me. They were preparing to endure me until they didn't need me anymore. I saw it in the way Caleb was suddenly looped into threads I wasn't on, in the way documentation requests were framed as nice to have instead of mandatory. They wanted the benefits of my knowledge without fully absorbing it, like borrowing a ladder but never learning how to climb. Instead of confronting it head on, I adjusted. I stopped filling gaps they hadn't explicitly assigned. I documented everything obsessively, not because I trusted them, but because I wanted a record that couldn't be erased or minimized later. Every decision, every warning, every as discussed went into neat folders with timestamps and version histories. It felt paranoid until the day Evan casually mentioned in a call that they were mostly self-sufficient now, and I asked him to walk me through the billing reconciliation without notes. He couldn't. The pause stretched long enough that I could practically hear the gears grinding. "That's why we still value your partnership," he said eventually, but the word partnership rang hollow. That afternoon, I got an email from a former coworker I barely knew, someone in a different department, asking if I'd be open to talking about contract work elsewhere. She'd heard, she said, that I was the reason things didn't implode. The phrasing stuck with me, not because it flattered me, but because it reframed everything. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't disloyal. I wasn't someone who failed to disclose. I was a stabilizing force they'd taken for granted. Over the next week, 2 more messages came in, then a recruiter, then a startup founder who said he wanted to build things the right way from the beginning. I didn't say yes to anything yet, but for the first time in years, the future felt expansive instead of claustrophobic. Meanwhile, Marcy emailed to ask if I'd consider extending the contract another 3 months at the same terms, and I realized they still thought time was the only variable that mattered. I replied that I'd consider an extension once certain operational changes were implemented, and I listed them clearly. No fluff, no hedging. Her response was polite but non-committal, and that was my answer. They weren't going to change unless forced, and I was done being the thing that made dysfunction survivable. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me strangely peaceful. I'd already survived the worst part, the moment they decided I was disposable. Everything after that was just logistics. The breaking point came quietly, which surprised me because I'd always imagined it would be dramatic, some big confrontation or explosive email thread that finally pushed me out the door. Instead, it was a small thing, an almost polite request from Evan asking if I could quickly review a proposal they were sending to leadership about internal tooling improvements. When I opened the attachment, my stomach dropped because it was a deck that summarized months of my consulting work without once mentioning why those gaps had existed in the first place or who had identified them. My name appeared exactly once, buried in a footnote under external support, while the narrative framed everything as a proactive evolution driven by management foresight. It wasn't malicious so much as instinctual, the corporate reflex to rewrite history in a way that preserved hierarchy. I closed the file and sat there longer than I needed to, feeling the last thread of obligation unravel. I replied that reviewing strategic materials wasn't in scope and wished them luck with the presentation. Evan called immediately, voice tight with frustration. "This affects the systems you built," he said, like that should still mean something to me. "Then it should have been built correctly from the start," I replied, surprised at how calm I sounded. He tried to pivot to remind me how important continuity was, how leadership valued my perspective, and I realized he genuinely believed that words could substitute for action if said sincerely enough. After we hung up, I drafted a short, clear email to Marcy and Legal, stating that I would not be extending the contract beyond its current end date and that I'd complete all agreed-upon deliverables before then. No emotion, no explanation, just a boundary. Marcy responded with concern, asking if there was anything they could do to change my mind, and for a split second, I considered listing everything again, every structural issue they'd ignored. Instead, I wrote back that my decision was final and thanked her for the opportunity. The politeness felt almost radical. Over the next few weeks, I finished documenting, trained the remaining staff, and slowly withdrew my presence, like easing your hand out of something you've been holding too tightly for too long. The day my access finally expired, nothing dramatic happened. No calls, no emergencies, just an automated email confirming my credentials had been deactivated. I closed my laptop and realized I didn't feel empty or scared, just light, like I'd been carrying a weight so long I hadn't noticed how heavy it was until I put it down. That night, I updated my resume for the first time in years, not with desperation, but with clarity about what I did and what I would never do again. 3 weeks after my contract ended, I started a new rhythm that didn't revolve around crisis management or unread messages blinking like warnings. I took a short-term contract with a smaller company that paid me well and treated documentation like oxygen instead of an afterthought. And on my off days, I picked up extra shifts at the wine shop without shame, because for the first time, it wasn't a secret or a symbol of failure. It was just a choice. One afternoon, while restocking a shelf, I ran into Devin, who looked startled to see me somewhere so ordinary, like he'd only ever imagined me in conference rooms and dashboards. We chatted awkwardly, then he blurted out that things at the old company were fine, mostly, in the way people say fine when they mean fragile. He said leadership was learning, that they talked a lot about redundancy now, and I smiled and wished him luck without offering advice. That was the moment I knew I was done, not because they were suffering or succeeding, but because their outcomes no longer felt like my responsibility. Later that week, I got a LinkedIn message from Evan, carefully worded, congratulating me on my new chapter and saying he hoped there were no hard feelings. I stared at it longer than necessary, then archived it without replying, not out of bitterness, but because closure doesn't always require conversation. The hard feelings had burned off, leaving behind something quieter and more useful: discernment. I could see patterns now I'd been blind to before, the way loyalty is often rewarded with dependence instead of respect, the way being indispensable is only valuable until it becomes inconvenient. I thought about the photo that started it all, that blurry proof of a life outside the office, and how absurd it was that needing more than one income had been framed as betrayal. In a strange way, being fired had given me permission to stop shrinking myself to fit inside someone else's expectations of dedication. I stopped apologizing for boundaries. I stopped explaining my worth. I started asking better questions in interviews, not just about pay, but about failure, backup plans, and what happened when people left. And when answers were vague, I walked away. That was the real revenge, if you could call it that. Not burning bridges, not gloating, just refusing to cross into the same trap again. The world didn't end when they walked me out with security. It expanded. I never went back to that building, never stood under the same streetlight where that blurry photo had been taken. But sometimes I think about how close I came to believing their version of events, the one where I was careless, dishonest, undeserving of stability because I needed more than one paycheck. The truth is quieter and harder to sell in a handbook. The system worked because someone cared enough to understand it fully, and it broke the moment that care was treated as a liability instead of an asset. In the months that followed, my life didn't magically become perfect, but it became honest. I worked fewer hours and got paid more. I said no without rehearsing excuses. I slept through the night without waiting for my phone to buzz. When people asked why I'd left my old job, I stopped telling the sanitized version and started telling the real one. Not bitterly, just clearly. Some nodded in recognition, some got uncomfortable. Both reactions told me what I needed to know. Every so often, I'd hear through the grapevine that my former company had hired another consultant, then another, that things were still a bit messy, and instead of satisfaction, I felt something like distance, the emotional equivalent of moving to a new city where your old problems can't follow. If there's a lesson in all this, it's not about revenge or clever leverage or even knowing your worth, because those phrases get thrown around until they lose meaning. It's about understanding that loyalty without boundaries is just slow self-erasure, and that the moment a workplace treats your survival strategies as moral failures, it's already telling you how replaceable it thinks you are. Getting fired hurt, deeply and unexpectedly, but it also stripped away an illusion I'd been clinging to for years. I wasn't fired for having 2 jobs. I was fired for reminding them, unintentionally, that I was more than one role, more than one system, more than something they could fully own. And once I understood that, walking away wasn't a loss. It was the first clean decision I'd made in a very long time.